welcome to the Ctbuh 2010 World Conference India. We have an incredible 3 days planned, as I'm sure you've seen from the programme already. I'd like to invite Mr. Korea and David Nelson from Foster's. Whilst Charles and David are joining us on stage, let me just explain a couple of things about the next 3 days, and this is for the benefit of speakers, session chairs, and the audience. Every speaker has 25 minutes for their presentation, and we would respectfully ask every speaker to please stick to the 25 minutes so things don't go over. And at Ctbuh we have a little tradition of using a little bell when you have 2 minutes left, so when you have spoken for 23 minutes. So we'll try this out. So nobody gets embarrassed. That's just a reminder for the speaker and the audience that there's 2 minutes left on the presentation. It is my great pleasure to welcome David Nelson here today. I think the company Norman Foster & Associates is known to, or should be known to everybody in the room. And I think of some of the major advances in buildings and more recently in new city developments has emanated from the practice of Foster & Associates in London. And David is the head of design for Foster in London, and he's going to tell us about some of the great work that they're doing there. So could we please welcome David Nelson to the podium.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity of being able to be here and to talk to you. Clearly, the question of cities and density is right at the fore, and particularly in this city. I think it really sets some enormous challenges about how the world is developing, and particularly in places like here. You know, when you listen to the words said earlier about 60% of the people of Mumbai living in a slum, then how can we bring about a change? How can we alter those set of circumstances? And it really comes down, as always, to a lot of individuals and about how we want to live in facing the issues that we face today. How do we want to live, and how do we want to design? And I think if you look and talk to a lot of people around the world, this image here would exemplify an ideal, something that would be a great way to be. You can see it's definitely out of a city. It's definitely low rise. It's very car dominant. And although this shot, if you look very carefully, is fairly obviously in America, what's actually happening in a lot of the cities around the world, the existing cities, really there is a kind of decanting from the city centre. So if you look on the outskirts of Paris or London or Sydney, those examples, literally this lifestyle is being emulated and focused on. And even here, maybe in a minor way, everywhere we go, there's this desire to sort of live like this, which really, the truth is, although it would solve a lot of the issues if we could, to actually live in that manner would take 3 planets to sustain it. So although it's an ideal for many people in the world, here and everywhere, it actually isn't really the answer. And therefore the problem becomes even more complicated, particularly when one rolls into the conversation that word called sustainability. Now, I've been showing this chart for about the last 20 years, and I make no apology for showing it again. Its primary function, it's got gasoline consumption on the vertical elevation and density along the bottom, and is usually used in conversations that reinforce the idea of density. Well, clearly here, density's gone beyond an extreme, and it might really, the solution may well be in contexts such as Mumbai is to consider new cities, new focal points. And if we were going to do that, how would we design them? You can see that in the nature of the chart, if you look towards the car-based cities, they are infinitely more energy consumption, waste, and all the things that go together to make up those parameters that we need to be designing very carefully for to do with sustainability. The car-dependent cities lend themselves very well to high-rise. So if you look at the kind of massive distribution here on those car organized parts of the planet and think about littering them with high-rise, then obviously that's a fairly easy thing to do. The plots are very low density and therefore can be increased. But, really, for the way human beings should exist and interact with one another, it's really the more traditional cities, the ones on the left-hand side here, that really create the kind of spaces and places that we all know and think about whenever your mind goes to any city around the world that's in this traditional pattern. And those people in those traditional cities don't like high-rise. They refuse them. They don't want them. There's protests against them. So maybe the new city has to find ways of combining the advantages of both of these two approaches in coming forward to, create places and spaces within a city context, whether it's markets and where people buy the food, the civic spaces on a grand scale that have evolved over many times, and those quiet and private spaces in cities that are so essential to the way that we live. If we're going to give an alternative to being out in those suburbs, which we have to, then this kind of space, this quality of space, is really something that we need to consider. And it does go all over the world, even here. The nature of spaces and the way they've evolved and the way they've been put together. These are the places that are never in any designer or engineer's brief. Nobody asks for these. At best, in the process of designing and planning, we're able to suggest them and put them forward and actually incorporate them into a plan. But this is really the focus of where we need to consider what are the places for people and how do we want to live. And just to emphasize a little bit more to do with that, this is a survey that we did in London. We talked about that way of living outside in the suburbs. And this analyzes literally the kind of tons or kilograms of CO2 used per annum. If somebody lives outside in the suburbs, they drive to work and back every day, and they're in a typical air-conditioned building in the center of the city. And there's a whole range of this. If you go through hybrid cars, eco-homes, trains, all the way down through to living right in the center of a city such as this, where you live in a good performance apartment, you use public transport, and really your office space is really state-of-the-art in terms of its environmental performance, 80% less. So in the same city, you can get people living outside and coming in and living in the center and consuming literally a huge amount less in terms of creating CO2. And density has got a bad name. People don't like density in many, many places. And it's kind of ironic that throughout the world, particularly in these European contexts, some of the most expensive property is actually kind of in very dense areas. And you can see here that this is sort of 13,700 people per hectare. And a typical modern development would be far, far less than that. And it's not an unpleasant way of living, space and residential. Now, every now and then there's an opportunity that can focus thoughts about how we should bring together our cities. But it's very important that when we do so, we do focus onto the context in which they're located. And we're very privileged, and many of us, in fact, probably a lot of people in this room, are working on this project in Masdar. I'm here merely as an ambassador for it. A lot of things I'm going to say and put forward really are the work of a lot of people, all focused with the intention of considering sustainable city design in this rather hostile environment of the desert here in Abu Dhabi. And obviously, it's quite interesting to sort of think about the fact that air conditioning, the space that we're in, has really only existed probably in a really intensive way for about 60 years or so, maybe after World War II. The distribution around the world has given us this way of thinking. We can create space such as this and cool it. And if you go back before that influx of air conditioning, you realize there are thousands and thousands of years of development of people in different climates around the world who have actually been very ingenious about thinking about how to mitigate the conditions that they find themselves in. So when we started to consider the master plan for Masdar, we really wanted to try and understand exactly how, by using design in the way that traditional cities had evolved in this kind of climate, how they really work with, or what could we do? Can we use some of those spaces, and can we create a different attitude towards their sort of thermal performance in particular. And you can see through here from the open desert, these are felt temperatures, what it actually feels like to be in the space. And you can cause considerable drops, literally, by configuring buildings and spaces. And it's very good to go and study these locations, to actually physically be there and think about the dimensions. You see the buildings are very close together. It's something that design in the world, probably since the fire of London, has been fighting against. Everything should be opened up. Sure, it should be in northern European locations, but in here, where the sun is so intense, the idea of bringing these walls together from a temperature point of view and also to control the light is something that we try to embody within the thinking of the plan. Masdar really is, in one level, a kind of artificial situation. It's the plot of land that was available, big-scale plot of land, and it was focusing on what would we put there, what quantum of people and activity would we locate on this piece of land, and also allow area around it to help balance that CO2 equation that's very, very important. You can see here the density is very high, and just in comparison with Venice there, you can feel, the grain and the way it actually hangs together. And in designing somewhere from scratch, obviously thinking about the orientation of the city, where the best position is for sun and for light and for air movement, really evolved into this grid pattern, this sort of off north-south orientation to achieve that balance. It has something like about 90,000 people in its fully developed state who will be living and working on that site. And actually it's very important that the uses and the activities in some way emulate the richness of an evolved city. So the uses are not zoned out into particular areas, they're mixed up and integrated together, whether that's industry or office space or where you live. Everything in here should be a 24-hour operation. It should give the life and the kind of excitement of being in a place if it's to be a success. This is the master plan in a fully developed form, and you can see the areas around it which are going to be used as part of the development of the university. At the heart of the building here is a university, and this is the way that some of the architecture, very much of today, is trying to actually bring together some of those parameters of building close, letting light in, letting it come down through into the spaces. Industry, very flexible zones there. As we start on this exercise, we don't know what the industry is going to end up being, so the production space is also very important. And open areas is not all literally in those narrow streets. The plan opens up to let airflow come through the city and by creating green spaces running through them. And it's interesting in this particular climate, there is always some air movement going from the sea to the land and from the land back to the sea, and therefore this integrating this with the thinking and the planning from day one. It would be very different here in this climate, but in the context that we're talking about, the idea of using wind during the day and during the night to actually irrigate the city and bring air movement down to street level. And really in planning, all the parameters that do need to come together to form a zero carbon, zero waste strategy really have to harmonize. And there are a number of very large-scale issues, bigger than architecture, to do with energy production, to do with waste management, to do with mobility, all those things that if one's thinking about it all at the same time, we've got to bring together all those activities and bit by bit, piece by piece, in a very detailed way, really analyze everything down to achieve the targets. This shows you the area that surrounds the central part of the city. And clearly in this location, the amount of the obvious source for power would really come from the sun. And scaling that right, with a mixture of photovoltaic cells, the thermal tubes and concentrated solar power is a very difficult balance. And this balance is moving all the time through here. And waste to energy is also a key part of it. But it's a big program that needs to be thought about at the scale. And for the first instance, this 10 megawatt solar plant has now been created. So all the power that's on site for those working on site, up to over 100 people now, and I'm not including the actual people building it, just the people there who are designing it, and also for the power for construction is all coming from this renewable source. Water is an absolutely colossal problem in any desert environment, and here as well. An obvious strategy to look at desalination, but you end up with a lot of salt, and quite often from the desalination process, that salt's put back into the sea, which seems to be a slightly illogical thing, but because it really compounds the problem. So what do we do with the salt? Well, Masdar is a university at its heart. The idea of literally having an institute there that can study everything to do with sustainable design. One of the obvious things would be to study what do we do with all this salt. Industry can only take a certain amount. And then things like the kind of complete material cycle, the sort of cradle-to-cradle conversations that we're all very familiar with in the sustainable environment, to actually do it and to put it into operation. You realize on the scale of this, it's not really been done. And a huge part of Masdar is, in fact, not so much this project, but the initiative behind it, in order to actually get answers to how do you go through this process of analyzing things and how they're delivered. It includes packaging, how much can you recycle, what's the energy cost for recycling, where do we get the materials from. You realize it's a massive matrix which has to be brought together, and part of the objective of doing this is to actually study that and to develop it. We talked a lot about traffic and the way it works, but really it's a mobility plan, right from how far you're prepared to walk. And in a very hot climate such as this, it's not very far. And therefore, what happens between that and the car is very, very crucial. How it can integrate with light rail systems and also a personal rapid transit system, which actually runs underneath the city. And you can see here in this section, we did that for speed. It's got to be efficient. You've got to be able to get from anywhere in the city to anywhere else, and therefore running that just below pavement level rather than it continually stopping and starting at ground level was something that we took. And this is becoming a reality. This is the space. This is the Undercroft area where that transit system and services will run. So the whole city is elevated up onto a platform. And you can see the construction here moving forward now on that first phase. The university is a tremendous engine. Within the city, that red block is the first phase, and it is the institute. It actually can create startup companies and businesses. If its whole curriculum is focused on sustainable strategies, then really it has an opportunity to produce something very, very interesting. And it's very consciously being used as an engine for the development of this location. This is how the first phase works. It's a mixture of residential and university. The spaces that we create in here have to be very flexible. The science being invented, we don't know what it is. So 3 years after occupation, it's likely that all things will need to change. And the idea of building in such a level of flexibility into these laboratories in the first instance is fundamental to allowing that long-term view to be maintained. It also forces invention. The laboratories do need to be air-conditioned. We need to keep a constant series of results, and therefore how they're insulated and how they're put together. We have to invent new systems and new methods of cladding those buildings and insulating them. So these are some of the views. This is the student accommodation, very tall ceilings. We're part of a kind of a natural ventilation strategy that we're developing here. And gradually, bit by bit, this is now coming to fruition. The screens give privacy, but also allow for a view, let light through, working very closely with artists, local artists who have an understanding and a feeling for this Islamic language to be incorporated into the overall plan. And traditional devices such as this, the wind tower, this is our modern take on a traditional wind tower, using the science and the technology behind what was a very traditional device, but actually interpreting that in a new way. And here you can see the first one of these under construction now. The Learning Centre, another part of the plan, a real sort of social focal point within the overall strategy of this first phase, coming together and being produced now. Now that's the first phase, which should be completed towards the end of this year, and already the second stage is under development. This is now more residential and more office space, and this looks very much right out to the perimeter of the city, where there's a different set of problems. And when we study that and look at it particularly from an air movement point of view, there's an opportunity to open up on the perimeter of the city in order to allow more air inside. As we move forward in more and more detail, more and more knowledge is gained about how that's actually, how those objectives are achieved during daytime and nighttime. A lot of what we're trying to do is literally inform the shape of the buildings by thinking about that airflow over the tops of the roofs. So the design of these allows for that air to be manipulated through the space and around it, using the technology that's ever increasingly available to help us do that. And the creation of public spaces in amongst that residential area. Gardens, in this instance, heavily landscaped, but every tree has been analysed. Every type of tree, how much water it's going to take every day, has all got to be calculated and totaled through right to the end of the project and beyond. There's a very, very precise set of exercises that need to take place if one wants to prove out the whole concept of this being sustainable. These are some views. When it gets to the edge of the city, it steps down, as you can see here. The undercroft then marches down, so there are ways out into the landscape around it. And this gives you really a view of what that edge condition is starting to be like. And all of that new location is already under construction. All of the piles are in for construction to develop. And really, we hope the lessons that are learned from this through time, and it will be a long time as this evolves, if something becomes the real legacy of what Masdar is all about. And that hopefully will be used and be relevant in part to other projects around the world. Thank you very much.